Today, I'm going to show you how to improve the appearance of rocks and other objects that intersect with the landscape. We're going to smooth out this hard transition here by blending the rocks material with the landscape material. Let's get started. Before we begin, there are two things that we need to fix on our landscape. If you haven't seen last week's video, be sure to go back and watch that because I show you how to set up something called the Runtime virtual texture on the landscape, and we're going to need that in today's video. One of the things that I discovered at the end of last week's video is that our landscape is a little bit blurry looking. It's kind of low resolution, and we lost some quality when we went from our original landscape material to the Runtime virtual texture material. Today we're going to fix that. What I discovered about our landscape is the reason it's low resolution is not because of the Runtime virtual texture itself, but because of the materials that we're feeding into the Runtime virtual texture. In our core material, we're using, and let me pull that up just to show you. I'm looking at this material function that we created previously called MF Landscape Matte. If we look in this material, you can see that I've put in some features that help us to get rid of tiling. So here you can see that I have a camera depth fade node, and so we are blending between a really tightly tiled near material and a medium material that has less tiling. And I'm using the distance from the camera to blend between our medium material and our near material. Well, the problem with using this strategy for getting rid of tiling and using Runtime virtual textures is that when the Runtime virtual texture tiles are rendered into the cache, there is no camera, and so the engine has no concept of this camera depth fade node, and we're unable to use this type of blending that uses a camera. And so what this means is I'm going to need to rethink my strategy for getting rid of tiling now that we're using Runtime virtual textures. So what I'm going to do to get around this for now is I'm going to take this material down here that we created for tiling our landscape textures up close, and I'm just going to wire that directly into our unpack CR NOH function. So instead of blending our near material with our medium material, I'm just going to go with purely our medium or our near material. So I'm going to wire this lerp here directly into CR, and I'm going to wire this lerp directly into NRH. And so what we're doing here is we're skipping the blend that's using our camera fade, and we're just going directly from our close-up material out to the rest of the landscape material. So if I save this and we switch back to the landscape, now you can see our landscape material is significantly more detailed. It's a lot sharper and higher resolution than the one that we had last week. So I just wanted to show you that fix before we went on with today's video about blending in rocks and other landscape objects. Now, if you look off in the distance here, let me see if I can find a spot where it's obvious. Yeah, maybe on this mountain over here. You can see there's significantly more tiling happening now. And so like I said, I'm going to need to rethink this strategy of breaking up the tiling, especially off in the distance, now that we've gotten rid of that strategy for improving the tiling on the landscape. And so I'll have to talk about that in a future video, but for now we'll just call that good and move right into the portion of blending in rocks and other objects with the landscape. So the problem that we're trying to solve today is this really hard seam between my rock here and where it intersects the landscape. And what we want to do is sample from our runtime virtual texture and then blend the landscape's texture with the rock's texture so that we can smooth out this hard scene. So we're going to need to edit the material on the rock, but before we do that, there's one other thing that's really important that we do. And that is we need to make sure that we're storing height data from our landscape into a runtime virtual texture. So I'm going to select my landscape and scroll down here in the details panel to the virtual texture section. You can see here, render to virtual texture. Right now I've just got one texture here. It's the one that's storing my color, roughness, specular, and normal data. And I'm going to add one more virtual texture here to my landscape. So here it says none, and I'm just going to drop this down and create a new asset, a new runtime virtual texture. And in my case, I'm going to stick it in my textures folder here. And I actually happen to already have one. It's called my runtime virtual texture height. And so I'm going to use that one here. My runtime virtual texture height. So I'm going to select that and stick it into the slot. Then I'm going to double click it and open it up just to show you what the settings are. On my previous one that's storing my color and normal and other data, I had to turn these settings up quite a bit to get higher resolution. But for height data, we don't really need high resolution. And so I'm just going to leave these at their defaults. The other important thing that we need to do is to set the virtual texture content here to world height. All right, so that's all set up, and I've got two runtime virtual textures running. The other thing that's important to do is to come over here to the Place Actors panel, come to Volumes, Runtime Virtual Texture Volume, and I need to add a new volume that's specific for my height map. Last week we added this first one that was for my color, normal, and other data, but this new one is going to be for my height map. So I just added it to my scene, and now I'm going to hit Copy Rotation. Oh, whoops, I need to drop this down and pick my landscape. Then I can hit my Copy Rotation, Copy Bounds, and pick the texture that I want to use, and it's my runtime virtual texture height. Okay, so now my landscape is rendering its color, normal, roughness, and specular data into the first texture, and it's rendering its height data into the second texture. And so now we're ready to start editing the rocks material to blend with the material of the landscape. So I'm going to close my Place Actors dialog because we don't need that anymore. And I'm going to open this up and take a look at our rock here. So our rock is using our Granite Rock 3 instance. So I'll double click on that. And if I scroll down here, I can see that the parent material is called MS Default Material Displacement. So this material is stored in the Megascan's MS Presets folder here. And so if I come here to the MS Default Material Displacement, you can see that I have this MS Default Material Displacement material. And I'm going to clone this one. And instead of displacement, I'm going to call this one RVT Blend New. And we're going to edit this material now. So here we are in our new material. You can see that Quixel has given us settings for base color, metalness, roughness, normal, and here is all of the information for tessellation. We can get rid of all of this because we're not doing tessellation on our rock. And this is the area where we're going to work on the mask that we need for blending between the landscape material and our rock material. So the first thing that we need to do is set up a mask that allows us to determine where the landscape is and how far up our object we want to blend the landscape material. And so in order to do that, I need to bring in the height of my landscape. And I can do that with a runtime virtual texture sample. In this case, I want to sample the Runtime Virtual Texture height. And this is going to give us the height in world space where our landscape is located. Next, we need to find the height of our object that we're currently rendering. And I can do that with a world position node. And if I take the blue channel of the world position node, that's going to be the height. So I'm going to add a component mask and grab the Z component or the blue channel of the world position to get my height. And then I'm going to subtract the world height of my landscape from the height of the pixel that I'm currently rendering. And so what this is going to give me is the distance from the landscape to the current pixel that I'm rendering. The next thing that I need to do is get the bounding box of the object that I'm currently rendering. So I can do that with a node called object bounds. So I'm going to bring in the bounding box, and again I'm going to use this mask here that's giving me the blue channel, and this is going to tell me the height of my object. So the next thing that I need to do is take this distance from the landscape to the pixel that I'm rendering, and I need to add it together with the overall height of my object. I also need to give myself a control that will allow me to change how high up on the object I want the landscape to blend. So I'm going to multiply this object bounds here, the height of the object, with a new exposed parameter that I'm going to call height. And this is going to allow me to control the height of the terrain blending. Now in the group over here, I'm going to type the name RVT blend, just so the parameters that I'm using to control my runtime virtual texture will kind of be grouped together in the interface. I'm going to take this value and multiply it by 2. And then I'm going to take the value that we computed here and subtract it from this height value that we computed down here. All right, and then just for now, I'm going to saturate the result that we're getting here to clamp it between 0 and 1. And I'm going to plug this result just temporarily into our roughness channel so that we can take a look at what it's doing on our rock. So I'm going to save this and we'll jump back over to our scene. And here you can see that we're looking at just the roughness. I came over here and switched buffer visualization to roughness. And you can see that the mask that we've created so far is completely white. Well, let's see if we can change this at all if we edit the instance of the material. So here's our rock material instance. If I select the rock in the scene, double click on the instance slot here, the first thing that I need to do is make sure that I have my RVT blend new material assigned. And you can see now that I have this new parameter that I've added called height in the RVT blend settings section. So I'm just going to tear this off and let it float there so that I can tweak this setting while I see what the results are doing on my rock in the scene. So I'm going to turn on height and then adjust this value here. And you can see that now I'm able to control the amount of white. So where this mask is white is where the rock material is going to be applied. And where this mask is black is where the landscape material is applied. And I'm able to use this material to control how much landscape material versus rock material I'm going to want. So maybe I'll leave it right there. But the problem that I have now is that I have this kind of jagged edge that's really hard. And I need to actually maybe fuzz this out a little bit so that I can get some smooth blending instead of just adding another hard seam to my scene. So let's switch back to our material again and see if we can fix that. So what I need to do is come down here to where I'm creating my mask. And in between this subtract and saturate, I'm going to add a divide. And so I'm just going to divide my mask by another editable parameter, and I'm going to call this one blend. And again, I'm going to put blend in the RVT blend category so that this parameter shows up in its own category on my granite rock instance. Okay, so as soon as I save it, you can see that here on my instance, I have a new value here called blend. So I'm going to turn that on, come back to our scene, and you can see now that as I increase the value of blend, you can see that I get a nice blend here. Now maybe I'll adjust my height just a little bit. And now you can see I've got this area here, which is black, where my landscape material is going to go. And this area here that's white, which is where my rock material is going to go. So I'll have a nice blend between landscape and rock. So now that we've created our mask, the next thing that we need to do is actually create the blend. So I need to add a new Runtime Virtual Texture Sample node. And this one, instead of sampling the height, it's going to sample the color. And so now I need to add a couple of lerp nodes. I'm going to hold down the L key and just click. I'm going to add 4 of these because I need to blend my color, specular, roughness, and normal. And if we look at our mask here, you can see that the rock material needs to be in wherever the mask is white, and the landscape material needs to be where it's black. So with the texture data coming in for my landscape material, I'm going to plug these into the A port of the lerp because that's where the black values go. Specular, roughness, and normal. And then I'm going to plug my mask that I created down here into the alpha of each of the lerps. And if I haven't mentioned this before, the way a lerp node works is you give it 2 inputs and a mask, or the alpha, and it blends between the first input and the second input depending on if your mask is black or white or somewhere in between. So if my mask value is 0.5, I'll get half of A and half of B blended together. Okay, so I'm going to plug my base color into the B socket here of my lerp. I'm going to plug my specular intensity into the B socket of my lerp. And the same thing with roughness and normal. And then I'm going to plug all my lerps into my root node here. So I've got base color, I've got specular, I've got roughness and normal. And if I had an object with a metallic mask, I would want to give my terrain or my landscape material a default value of 0 because there's no metalness or metallic on terrain, but there might be some metallic on my object coming in. Now in this case, I know I'm dealing with a rock that has no metallic, so I'm not going to worry about it, but I could add another lerp here to blend between metallic and 0 for my landscape. All right, so let's save this and then switch back to our landscape, and I'm going to change my view back to lit. All right, let's take a look at our results. So we have a rock in our scene here, and I can move the rock around, and you can see that here on the sides, I'm actually blending between the landscape material and the rock material. So if I push it all the way down, you can see that now the rock is basically just has landscape applied. And as it pulls farther away from the landscape, it has more and more of its own material until if I make the rock floating up here, now it has all of its own material and none of the landscape applied. But what we've been able to do here is get rid of that hard seam and just blend between the materials on the rock and the landscape. This is a really cool benefit of using Runtime Virtual Texture. So in the last week's video, we talked about how we're using Runtime Virtual Textures to save on performance and make our landscape material cheaper to render. And this week we are showing how we can also use it to blend the landscape material with other objects. I could do this with rocks, and I could do it on my tree trunks here. You can see how they have just a little bit of a hard line. And any other object that we need to kind of soften that transition from the landscape to the object, we can use these nice Runtime virtual textures. Now there is one gotcha that I want to make you aware of. If we switch back to our material here, I've got my Runtime virtual texture sample node selected, and you can see that I had to specify an explicit landscape material in this node. And so one of the weaknesses of this system is that this material that I've created is now specific for this specific landscape in this specific level. So if I wanted to take this rock and put it in another level, that would be a problem because it's still referencing the Runtime virtual texture from this level. And so I would need to make another set of materials for this rock and assign materials that were specific to that landscape to this rock. What would be ideal is if I could expose this material slot here as a parameter that was tweakable in the instance. And so that way I could just make custom instances for each level instead of custom materials for each level. But I don't think that's actually available to do in the engine. It's kind of a weakness of the way the current system is implemented. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video and that you're able to take this technique and use it to make some really cool blending between rocks and other objects that you place on your landscape. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope you come back next week to learn more about materials, landscapes, all kind of good stuff. We'll see you then.